Today, I'll be going interplanetary for the first time to satisfy the contract, position a satellite in a stationary orbit of Eve. This contract not only requires us to be in a very specific orbit, but to have our satellite situated over a specific waypoint on Eve's surface. But before we get to that, we need to look at how to get to Eve in the first place. This will involve taking a close look at the game's built-in maneuver tool, but I will also be looking at how to accomplish the transfer purely manually and without the assistance of any mods. As this craft will not be returning to Kerbin, we will have to transmit all of that science back. This will require taking a closer look at choosing appropriate communication antennas, as well as considering the electricity costs of transmitting all of that science home. Let's get started. Well, let's take a look at the contract here. Position a satellite in a stationary orbit of Eve, and we'll go over the objectives. Please note that this must be a new unmanned probe built for Stedler Engineering Corps after the contract is complete. In other words, no moving other probes to this location. You gotta build one new. And looking at the orbital specifics, you can see we have an apoapsis and periapsis in and around 10,000 kilometers and an inclination of 0. And we'll talk about what do you do if these numbers are very different when it comes to the budgeting part of this? But for now, just talking about inclination. Inclination differences really don't add a lot to the cost because you can control the inclination largely by just small burns way out from Eve, adjusting your incoming trajectory. So if this inclination is very different than 0, really don't worry about it too much in your budget. But going over the rest of this, build a new unmanned probe that has an antenna and can generate power. Reach stationary orbit, described up here, within minimal deviation. Hold stationary orbit directly above area J-HGB. So there's going to be a waypoint on the surface. And for those that don't know, a stationary orbit is an orbit where the period exactly matches the rotational period of the parent body. This has the effect of a satellite in a stationary orbit remaining over a fixed point on the surface. And that fixed point has a specific waypoint. So we'll talk about how we end up manipulating that. For now, just realize that doesn't add anything to the budget. So we'll deal with that when we get to it. We must have a thermometer on the satellite. We must have an SC-9001 Science Junior, a mystery goo, and maintain stability for 10 seconds, and a respectable payout and science and reputation as well. One thing I want to draw attention to is that in this game I have a Tier 3 tracking station, and what the Tier 3 tracking station does for you is, well, it improves the DSN, the Deep Space Network power. That is not actually 100% necessary to get to Eve. We'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about antennas during our build. But the main thing I'm going to be taking advantage of is this maneuver tool. So we'll be going to be talking about the maneuver tool once we do our burn out towards Eve. And if you don't have a Tier 3 tracking station, you don't have the maneuver tool available. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It just gets a lot more fiddly. But we'll be taking a look at that fiddly way of doing it too later in this video. But right now, let's go into research and development, take a look at the tech, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit so people can see where I am at. This entire build can pretty much be done from Tier 6 and lower, though the one node I would highly recommend that people have is electronics to have the Communitron HG55 antenna. You can get away with the lower tier DTS-M1 antenna, though it is a little bit sketchy. So I would really recommend going to this one once you start going interplanetary. But I have a ton of science thanks to that Eve mission that I did last episode, so why don't I take advantage of it? And if I go way out to here, Advanced Science Tech, I have the GravMax negative gravioli detector. This thing is a science magnet, and since I'm going to be going to Eve and probably won't be back for some time, if at all. I want to be able to take advantage of this and really haul in the science. But if we take a look, notice that the note here is grayed out, and if you read it here, it says this costs 550 science, but I cannot research technologies over 500 science at this level. This is referring to the level of research and development. To get this tier and up, you have to be tier 3 for the R&D center. So I'm going to come out and right click on here, and you can see that it's an expensive upgrade. In fact, it is the most expensive upgrade in the game to go to a tier 3 R&D center, but I have a lot of money, so I am going to go for it. So we're going to go up to our final tier on research and development, go back in, and now I can get, notice I'm coming at it from a funny path here. I can get advanced science skipping over this node, and there we go, 550 science. However, do note that I'm only going to be using the gravioli detector. You can fully build the vessel you're about to see without this part if you've not unlocked this node yet. But before we get into our build, let's get into a budget, and we're going to be taking a look at a part of the Delta V map that we've not gone to before. And as always, I like to think of these things backwards, starting from the last thing which I'm going to do, which is going to be doing a capture about Eve, which is 1300 meters per second. Now, take a look at the little triangle here. It's telling you that you have an opportunity to aerobrake. Aerobraking is using the atmosphere of the parent body, in this case Eve, to remove energy from the orbit and get your capture at a significantly reduced cost. Eve's atmosphere is very effective at this. In fact, it's so effective it can be destructively effective. It's a very thick atmosphere, and I'm not going to build a probe that's really going to be designed to handle that, so I'm going to ignore the aerobraking part and just eat this whole 1300 meter per second insertion cost. Now, this cost is really for capturing into a 100 kilometer orbit, and our orbit's going to be more like 10,000 kilometers. Is there a huge difference between the capture cost between a 100 kilometer orbit and a 10,000 kilometer orbit? The answer to that question is actually no for Eve. You really have to be careful with this. It gets very, very complicated, but for Eve, getting a capture wherever costs about the same, so you don't have to modify your budget. For other bodies, though, it can change. And if you really want to get into the math of all this, I do have a video that you can take a look at if you are interested in it. But for now, I'm going to call it 1300 meters per second and just move on. So moving along the subway route back towards Kerbin, we can see that it's 80 meters per second for our Eve capture, and then 90 meters per second for the transfer, which seems like a very, very small number, but don't ignore the 430 right above here. That indicates the worst case scenario for dealing with the inclination change. And this is a worst case scenario kind of number. It's unlikely you'll need to spend as much of this, but because Eve's orbit is a little bit inclined, and unlike Minmus, putting yourself into a matching parking orbit doesn't work for zeroing out this number, we really can't ignore it. So we're going to add that on. Moving down here towards Kerbin, we see 930 meters per second for the Kerbin ejection. If we add that all up, that comes out to be 2,830 meters per second to get from low Kerbin orbit to Eve orbit. However, I like to have that stage deal also with the upper part of our Kerbin orbital insertion, so I like to add on about an arbitrary about 1,000 meters per second. So I'm looking at building something that has a total delta V of about 3,830 meters per second. It can be a little more, a little less. That part of it doesn't really matter. All right, let's get started. With a hex probe core to which I added 3 octagonal struts as mounting surfaces, 1 on top and 2 below. I then added on the science equipment, starting with the Science Junior and Mystery Goo, both of which I would not have put on if not for them being in the contract requirements. As the probe will not be returning, all science is going to have to be transmitted, and I generally find the transmission return on these 2 experiments doesn't justify the mass that they add to the payload. However, I will definitely be including the thermometer, barometer, GravMax gravioli detector, and the magnetic boom. The seismic accelerometer will not be joining us as it can only collect science on the surface. Now, the one thing you really do have to think about is communication when it comes to interplanetary travel. It's probably your biggest limiting factor. A couple of Communitron 16s just aren't going to cut it. So we're going to go to the communication tab, and what gives me really nice communication for Eve and also for Duna, by the way, are the Communitron HG-55, and I'm going to put on 2 of them. Yeah, unfortunately, once you go interplanetary, you have to step it up a bit, especially if you want to get decent science return. The strength of your communication signal back to the KSC will affect how much science you can transmit home. And as you'll see later in the video, these 2 antennas combined with my Tier 3 tracking station will get me the full 40% science transmission bonus. Even with the Tier 2 tracking station, these will still do a very good job, perhaps not getting the full science bonus, but they will be able to transmit just fine. If you do not have the HG-55s unlocked yet, you can get away with 2 DTS-M1 antennas. You will be able to control your probe and transmit science even with just a Tier 2 tracking station, but you'll guarantee not get the full transmission bonus. If you want to get into the math of all of that, I do have a video here that you can check out, and it goes through all of the terrible details. But if you want to just trust me that this is a good setup for Eve and also for Duna, you can just trust me on that. Now, one thing we do have to think about when it comes to antennas is electricity. If I go over here and right-click on the Communitron HG-55 and look at its electric charge requirements, it's kind of shocking. 133.3 units of electric charge per second. But notice that this is only when transmitting. So while it's not transmitting, in other words, you're not transmitting any science, it's not using up any electricity at all. But as soon as you hit that transmit science button for that length of the transmission, it's using 133.3 units of electric charge per second. To say that it is exceedingly difficult to cover that with, say, solar generation is putting it mildly. If we go over to electricity and take a look, for instance, here at these solar cells, they only generate 1.6 units of electric charge per second. So you're not going to get into solar panels to cover this charge. What you want to do is cover this cost with batteries. So put on enough batteries so that when you transmit, it'll just use the power from the batteries. Now, the question then becomes, how much batteries do you need? To help you determine that, you need to go up to here and take a look at the bandwidth, which is 20 MITs per second. Although it doesn't quite work this way, effectively you can think of a MIT as a science point. So if you're transmitting 100 science, that's like 100 MITs. So what you got to do now is think, well, how much science am I going to transmit? So for instance, let's say at most I'm going to transmit, say, 200 science. Okay, 200 science at 20 MITs per second means that it'll take 10 seconds to transmit that science. That means that this will be draining 133.3 electric charge per second, so times 10, that's 1,333 units of electric charge. So if I want to transmit 200 units of science, I want to make sure that I have 1,333 electric charge sitting on the vehicle. And the way I accomplished that is I grabbed 4 of these Z400 batteries. They're 400 units of electric charge each. So that's 1,600 units. That should take care of any transmitting that I might have. For electrical generation, now that the batteries are taking care of our transmission needs, I don't need much solar generation. I do need to recharge the batteries between rounds of transmitting, but that's really just about it. So I just went with a pair of AUX-4L 1x6 photovoltaic panels. This will do the job nicely. These are the ones that do not retract, because once this probe is in space, there will be no need to ever retract the panels, and adding on the retractable ones only adds on unnecessary mass. But with that all done, it's time to now start thinking about propulsion. So I started by putting on an Oscar B fuel tank, underneath which went an octagonal strut, and then the 48-7S Spark liquid fuel engine. Now this thing can handle a lot more fuel, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to surround this with R-4 dumpling fuel tanks, And 4-way symmetry will work with this, and actually 6-way symmetry will still fit nicely. But what if I wanted to go in between? What if I wanted to go for 5-way symmetry? Well, if you take a look down here at the little bottom, there's 6-way symmetry, there's 4-way symmetry, but there is no 5 in between. You could probably just place 5 around there, but getting them perfectly symmetric is going to be challenging. So I'm going to show you a trick how to get perfect 5-way symmetry. And this trick, by the way, also works for 7-way symmetry. So I'm going to take these off for now. And what you do is you grab another piece, like I'm just going to grab the cubic octagonal strut, and whatever symmetry you're shooting for, go one above that. So I'm shooting for 5-way symmetry, so I'm going to put these on with 6-way symmetry, just like that, just like I normally would. Then I'm going to right click on one of those parts and I'm going to remove it from symmetry. And again, if you're not seeing remove from symmetry, go into your settings and put on advanced tweakable. So I'm going to remove from symmetry, I'm going to grab that, throw it away. So now there's only 5, but clearly they're not very symmetric. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the balls here on there. So now there's 5 balls, though not symmetric. But watch what happens if I grab one of these and move it to here and let it go. I have perfect 5-way symmetry on those fuel cans. I can now get rid of the 5 cubic struts that I was never really interested in, but there you go, 5 little dumpling fuel cans in perfect symmetry around there. And like I said, you can do this for 7-way symmetry. Just simply start with 8, take one of the parts out, and then you can go down to 7. And now once these are in here, you can use the same move and rotate tools to your heart's content. This is admittedly a bug, but it's one of the bugs that's so great, I think it's really a feature. But either way, that's still well short of getting me to E. Remember, I'm looking for a total of around 3,830 meters per second, and that's going to require another stage. So on went a TD-06 decoupler, followed by an Oscar B fuel tank, then a 1.25 meter fairing to enclose this whole payload, an FL-T400 fuel tank, followed by the ever-reliable LV-909 Terrier liquid fuel engine. And after adding on the obligatory blinky lights, that gets me a delta V of 3,829, which is in our ballpark, and a thrust to weight ratio of 1.22. Again, perfectly adequate. And it's time now to get this thing into orbit by adding a booster. Again, budgeting for this tutorial series, I sit with the generous 3,800 meters per second to get into low Kerbin orbit. And if I add that on to the 2,830 I have budgeted thus far, that gets me a total of 6,630 meters per second. And if you recall, a few episodes ago, I talked about how to build a booster library in the sub-assemblies. You can check out this video over here if you want to see exactly how to do that. But I found that booster number 2 from a previous build serviced this perfectly. And we're going to drop that under there, fix up our staging, which always seems to get messed up when you do this. And that gets me a total vacuum delta V of 6,665 meters per second, which is going to be perfect. And for those people following at home, we have a TD-12 decoupler, underneath of which is an FL-T200 fuel tank, and then 2 FL-T400 fuel tanks with a set of advanced inline stabilizers in between, and a swivel engine on the bottom with 4 small basic tail fins. That makes up the core. For the boosters, it's just the TD-38K radial decouplers, and then 2 of the BACC Thumper solid fuel boosters, a couple of small nose cones, and then to help push away the nose cone, I do have these basic fins, which if you want to lose, that's perfectly fine. And with some final tweaking, including tweaking the thrust limiter on the SRBs for a more appropriate launch thrust to weight ratio, this thing was ready to go. This is being inserted into a very standard 80-kilometer equatorial parking orbit, something that I've done approximately a bazillion times in this series and won't be going over again here. What I will do, though, is welcome aboard my most recent Patreon patron, Jamie Carmichael. Thank you very much, Jamie, for your support, as well as to the ongoing and generous support from all of my Patreon patrons and YouTube members. You will see all of their names in the end credits of this video, and if you would like to join this illustrious group, the links are in the down below. Don't forget that this vessel is carrying a new science part, the GravMax negative gravioli detector. This part only works once you are in space, but it is biome specific, and not only here in near space. In fact, it is the only stock science part that is also biome specific in high space. This means that this little probe will be able to perform many gravity scans on this mission, starting with taking some time to get scans over the various biomes here in low Kerbin orbit. But with that done, it is time to look at getting this thing on its way to Eve. We'll take a look at setting this up manually in a little bit, but we'll start by looking at the game's built-in tool for this. So what we're going to take a look at is the maneuver tool, which we see right here, which again, you need to have a tier 3 tracking station in order to unlock, and it can plot maneuvers for you with some limitations that we'll get to in just a little bit. So for instance, here I can see that, wow, I can plot a maneuver to the moon. That's great. Why don't I just do that just to show you how it works? So we're going to plot our maneuver to the moon, and it's got an 852.3 meter per second burn to get us out towards the moon. Everything sounds great until you get down here to the bottom and notice that the burn doesn't come up for 5 days, 3 hours. And we know that you can always go to the moon on your current orbit, and the period of our orbit here is only about 30 minutes. It should never get more than about 30 minutes to do a burn to the moon. There is something goofy in this. I'm not 100% sure exactly what it's looking for. Maybe it has to do with my slightly, and I mean slightly eccentric orbit, that it's looking for the absolute cheapest burn, even down to the tenths of a meter per second. I don't know. But for going to miss going to the moon, to be honest, this maneuver tool is pretty much useless. I would never use it for that, and that's why I haven't been using it in previous tutorials. One thing, though, to be careful about is notice the little toggle here that says create an alarm. If you have that toggled on, I'm going to actually toggle it off right now because I hate the fact that it creates an alarm for me automatically. If I go over to my alarms up here at the very, very top left, notice that it created an alarm, and deleting this node does not take away this alarm. So I got an alarm coming up in 5.5 days. I don't want that to happen. That's useless for me. So let's delete this alarm. It is now gone. And let's use this maneuver tool to plot ourselves to Eve, because once you start going interplanetary, the maneuver tool, for all its faults, is way better than doing this by hand. So all you got to do is get the little down arrow, select Eve, and go create this maneuver. And so it is created now a 1072.6 meter per second maneuver, quite a bit less than the 1,450 that the Delta V map would budget for this. And the reason for that is, if I go into the details of the maneuver, notice that there's a normal component to this. It's not just simply prograde, but also normal. And that is getting us our encounter with Eve, if I scroll on out, in just a single burn, right? And taking care of the fact that there is an inclination difference with Eve for us with this bit of a normal correction. So that is why, by combining both the correction and the actual ejection from Kerbin into a single burn, it is saving us a bit of fuel with that. And again, remember that 430 that is on the map for dealing with the inclination difference is a worst case scenario, and it is very much a very worst case scenario. Now you might be looking at, oh my God, you were complaining about it being 5 days to go to the moon. Here, if we take a look at the start of the burn, it's in 1 year and 45 days. Is there one coming up sooner? And the answer to that question is no, at least not one that's going to cost as little as this, or anything close to as little as this. And as we time warp to this maneuver, I'll talk about why that happens to be the case. But before we get to that, go back here to the maneuver tool. There are a couple of extra little tabs here, so let's just take a quick look at them so people know that they are here. If we open this one up, it's a transfer window timing. So what this does is it gives you when the next transfer windows are to each of the various bodies in the Kerbal system, if you ignore the Moon and Mimbus. I think that's why the asterisks are there. So I would not look at these two. We know how to get to those fine. But if you want to know, when's your next opportunity to get to Moho or to Duna or to Drez, you can look them up here. And if you are planning out your missions and just want to go to the next one that's available, these are kind of handy there for you to take a look at. Close that one. And if we take a look at the other one here, what it does is it gives you a visualization of our transfer, in this case from Kerbin over to Eve. But the useful information really is, when is your departure time, when is your arrival time, and how long is it going to take you to get there. So if you need that information is available to you along with some groovy little graphics. Okay, I'm just about ready to do this burn, but before I do, I want to focus my view here on Eve. Now, sometimes you can't do it with the mouse, so remember you can just use the tab key to cycle through the various bodies until you are on Eve. And we're going to zoom on in here, and we'll take a look at our trajectory coming in here. So here's our trajectory coming through Eve's SOI, and here is the orbit that we are shooting for. It sure would be nice if we could get this trajectory in a little bit closer. Oh, we can still tweak this maneuver. There's nothing to stop us from doing that. So if we scroll over, select the maneuver, put it on the little widgety tool, and turn the scale way down. I mean way down. And I would only mess with the prograde retrograde part, not the normal part. We will save the normal changing for mid-course correction. It's easier to do it then. But let's see if we can... Oh yeah, oh wow. And even that little, it's only at 0.02 meters per second. Even that made a big difference. So I'm just going to scroll my mouse wheel. I'm going to bring that periapsis in closer, so it is right underneath that target orbit, because for Eve, that's the cheapest way to do it. Now, in other situations around other bodies, it's actually cheaper to come in really close to the parent body, taking advantage of the Oberth effect. I have a video that goes over that in detail if you are interested, but for here, the better option is going directly for the target orbit. The other thing you want to take a look at is the direction in which you are coming through here. Notice that this orbit is spinning around in this direction here, in a counterclockwise direction. We want to be encountering this orbit going in the same direction. If we scroll out here, this is us leaving Eve, our Eve escape. So we're coming through here. So actually at this point, I'm actually going in the opposite direction of the way I want to go. So the way I fix that is by continuing to scroll in a retrograde direction. I want to be on the other side of this orbit. And that's looking, I think, pretty happy with that. We'll deal with the rest of this with a correction. But in the meantime, I have this burn coming up in 1 year and 45 days. But before we time warp, I do want to set up an alarm. So I'm going to click on the little alarm clock icon here. And what I want to do is I want to create an alarm. So we do that by pushing the create alarm button. And you can put in a manual time, but I want to create an alarm for this maneuver. So we're going to select the maneuver. The default is it gives you 1 minute warning. I'm going to give myself 5 minutes warning. So it stops a little bit earlier, and we're going to add that alarm here. And so now I should feel safe just time warping to my heart's content, and it should stop automatically. So let's take this opportunity to talk about why this burn is so far in the future. As you may have guessed, it has to do with the relative positions of Kerbin and Eve. In truth, an interplanetary transfer isn't really that different from any other rendezvous. Eve is in a lower orbit than Kerbin and is thus moving faster. As such, we need to eject ourselves from Kerbin when Eve is behind Kerbin in their respective orbits. But how far behind does Eve need to be? The relative positions of the two objects in orbit about the same body, the Sun in this case, is measured by their phase angle. Imagine the lines connecting Kerbin and Eve to the Sun. These lines form an angle at the Sun that we call the phase angle. This angle is measured from Kerbin in the same direction as Kerbin is moving in its orbit. The necessary phase angle for a transfer from Kerbin to Eve is negative 54 degrees. The negative because Eve needs to be behind Kerbin, and our ejection burn is at the time the phase angle hits this number. As for where this negative 54 degrees comes from, there are a number of websites that contain this information. Or if you want to learn how to calculate it yourself, I do have a video on that very topic. Now, if you're doing this burn manually, before you make a maneuver, you would need to time warp until the phase angle is approximately correct. Although the game does have a phase angle window under the Advanced Orbital Info tab, unfortunately it is of limited use when doing interplanetary transfers. There are mods that will definitely help, but simply holding a protractor up to the screen will also work. When the phase angle is about right, place a maneuver node on the prograde side of Kerbin so that your ejection is in the retrograde direction relative to Kerbin's orbit, thus bringing down your periapsis with the Sun. Eject in the opposite direction if you happen to be heading to planets with higher orbits than Kerbin. If you hear people talking about ejection angles, there's no need to worry about that. Just tweak the exact timing of the burn to bring your periapsis with the Sun as low as possible, and the ejection angle will take care of itself. When doing this manually, I like to make this ejection burn prograde only, leaving the normal component for a mid-course correction. If you like, you can add in this mid-course correction before performing the ejection burn. Either way, it's now just tweaking these burns until you get as close an encounter as you can. And yes, I know there are a number of external tools and mods that will help with this, my personal favorite being a mod called Transfer Window Planner. But getting back to the burn that we set up using the maneuver tool, our alarm is just about to go off, indicating that we are now at the correct phase angle. There it goes. So all we have to do here is perform this burn. Now, one very important limitation to keep in mind when it comes to using that maneuver tool is that your parking orbit needs to be very close to being circular and very close to being equatorial. If your parking orbit is too eccentric or too inclined, the maneuver tool flat out will not work anything out for you. As we are coming towards the end of our burn, it gets very, very sensitive, so I have my throttle way down. Here it comes. And pop. There. That is more than fine enough. All right, so next step is going to be that mid-course correction, but we are now on our way away from Kerbin, and don't forget, once we're above 250 kilometers, we have more science that we can perform. All right, so we're going to do a gravity scan, and notice again, it is over Kerbin's grasslands. It is biome specific. So try and see how many of those biomes you can collect. As long as you are in Kerbin's SOI, keep checking those gravity scans. And of course, once you are outside of Kerbin's SOI, you are now orbiting the Sun. And in this series, this is the first time I've had something orbiting the Sun. So that is a whole pile of science right there. I'm going to use almost all the experiments. The only experiment I'm not using is the Science Junior and Mystery Goo, because I can only run each of those once. So I'm saving them for when I'm in Eve's SOI. And by the way, there are no biomes for the Sun, so unfortunately we're only going to be able to do one gravity scan this time. Then it comes time for the mid-course correction, which is performed, not surprisingly, about midway on our trek towards Eve. And if you've done these mid-course corrections on your way to the moon and on your way to Minmus, this is pretty much exactly the same thing. This tiny 10 meter per second burn is almost entirely normal with a touch of radial, the idea being to get the periapsis of our trajectory with Eve to be just touching the target orbit. This burn accomplished about 95% of that, and then I finished it off with a couple of very tiny burns once I was in Eve's SOI. But with that done, now comes the time to plan our capture, and that's going to be done with a burn right here at periapsis, and we're obviously going to need to eventually match this orbit. But it is a little bit more than that, because the contract requires us to position the satellite so it ends up above this waypoint. So how are we going to accomplish all of that? Well, it is going to require a teeny amount of math, but it isn't as complicated as it sounds. So the first important piece of information that you need in order to work this out is the rotational period of Eve. What is an Eve day? Thankfully, that information is available once you have Eve selected right over here on the right. If you click on this parameter information here, go down, it says rotational period, 3 days, 4 hours, and 21 minutes. Okay, I'm going to completely ignore the minutes because there's going to be a lot of eyeballing to all of this anyway. 3 days, 4 hours, okay. A Kerbin day, a day in this game, is 6 hours. So 3 times 6 is 18 plus 4 is 22 hours. So 22 hours is the amount of time it takes for Eve to do a complete revolution. Great. Okay, that's the first piece of information. Then we want to figure out, well, how much is this thing going to move in, say, an hour? Well, that's actually pretty easy. A complete rotation is 360. If we divide that by 22, well, I'm going to call this 15 degrees. Again, there's going to be a lot of eyeballing. I want a simple number. So let's say that this is going to move by 15 degrees in this direction. It always rotates counterclockwise. Everybody in the game rotates counterclockwise. 15 degrees every hour. Okay. Next step in all of this is, well, where's this this is where this waypoint is now. Where's the waypoint going to be by the time we get to here and perform this burn? Well, thankfully, that's actually not so hard. You can see here, it's telling us that we're going to be there in about 2 days. So 2 days is 12 hours. This, again, rotates 15 degrees per hour. So 12 hours times 15, that gets us 180 degrees. Well, that's actually turning out to be a pretty convenient number. So it's going to be, by the time we get to there, by the time we get to this periapsis, this is going to be completely on the opposite side of the planet, right about here. All right, so it's going to be about here. Now I need to estimate. Okay, let's scroll out a little bit. There we go. I wish you could see the waypoint and that, but you can't. So it's going to be about here. There's our periapsis. I can see we're going to have to now estimate this angle. And again, with a whole lot of eyeballing. And if you want to get mods like Kerbal Engineer, you can take a lot of this guesswork out. But we can do it with guesswork. I'm going to guesstimate this angle at about 15 degrees. So when we are here, the waypoint is going to be here. So we're going to be ahead of it, right? Remember, we're rotating around in this direction. So we're going to be 15 degrees ahead of it, approximately, by the time we're performing this maneuver. We need to drop back about 15 degrees. Well, remember, Eve rotates 15 degrees every hour. So we need to drop back about an hour from this. How are we going to do that? Well, if this orbital period of this red orbit is 22 hours and I want to drop back an hour, that means I need my period of my orbit of my capture to be 1 hour longer, 23 hours. So here's going to be the plan. I'm going to do a capture, put myself into an orbit with a period of 23 hours, and hopefully with all of this back of the envelope, it's not even back of the envelope for goodness sakes, because we're doing this all in our heads. But hopefully by the time we do one more orbit, we're going to be pretty close. And the game is pretty generous, by the way, with all of this. So my goal here is to create a capture right here at periapsis. And this is obviously going to be retrograde. And thankfully, let's just get to the point where we get the capture so we can see it. There we go. Thankfully, if I go down here to my orbital parameters, it's actually, there it is. It's actually giving me a period of this is the period, by the way, of the maneuver, right? See how it's changing as I do my maneuver? So this is giving me the period of this resulting orbit after the maneuver. And again, I want that to be 23 hours. That's going to be 4 days and 5 hours. So it's already a little bit too big. And this is where future me has to interject, because 23 hours is 3 days and 5 hours, not 4 days and 5 hours. And so not surprisingly, that silly math mistake is going to end up costing this. And I considered going back and redoing this mission again and doing it right. But I thought, you know what? Let's leave the screw up in there, because it'll show you how you can, if you don't want to do all of this math, how it's still completely doable, and also how to recover it in case you make bonehead arithmetic errors like I did. Now, one of the other things I'm looking at here is the inclination. I want to get the inclination down to 0 at the same time. And of course, that's going to be with a little bit of anti-normal. So I'm looking at two different parameters as I'm making this adjustment. I'm looking at my orbital period, but I'm also taking a look at my inclination. But once this maneuver was all set up, well, it's science time once again. We are now in Eve's SOI, so that is a lot more science, including this time I can run the one-off Mystery Goo and Science Juniors. Again, remember with the gravity scan that it is biome specific, even here in high space. So continue to do those gravity scans, trying to get as many biomes as you can. But once that was all taken care of, it was time to perform the burn. And as I'm performing this burn, I'm watching two things at the same time, both my inclination and my rather incorrect orbital period. Mostly actually the inclination, because the orbital period is really cheap to adjust after the fact, but the inclination is less so. Whoa, that was a boom. Anyway, once this burn was completed, in theory, all I should have to do is do one more orbit and I should end up directly above the required waypoint. But as you know, that wasn't going to happen. In fact, it looks like I'm off by about 90 degrees, which, if you do the math, is exactly how much I should be off, being 1 day off from what my right period would have been. So my math is good, but my arithmetic sucks. Anyway, what I could have done is redid that calculation and tried to zero this in again. But what I did instead is something that you can do if you don't want to do this math at all. I'm captured in an orbit with a period that is different than my target orbit. And all I gotta do is keep time warping, going around. Eventually, that waypoint will end up below the spacecraft when that spacecraft is at periapsis. And as I'm time warping, I'm particularly taking a look at the contract requirements, specifically the hold stationary orbit directly above area J-HGB, because that requirement goes green every time that waypoint is close enough to being directly below me. And eventually it happened. I ended up coming towards my periapsis. I can see that that contract requirement has gone green. So I quickly set up the maneuver for the final orbital insertion, performed the burn, waited the obligatory 10 seconds, and the contract was finished off. And with this contract finally complete, why don't I take a look at the main takeaways from this episode? This was the first interplanetary vessel of this series, so I spent a fair amount of time looking at design in the VAB. This included picking the appropriate antennas for an interplanetary voyage, as well as the additional electricity costs of transmitting science over long distances. And don't forget that building trick to get yourself 5 or 7-way symmetry. During the mission itself, I took a detailed look at how to use the game's built-in maneuver tool, which can be a great help with interplanetary transfers. But I also took a quick look at how to set up the transfer manually in case you don't have the maneuver tool available. Finally, I looked at how to manipulate your orbit so the craft will be stationary above a specific point on the surface, even if my arithmetic was a bit suspect. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. I hope that you found it useful, and that I'll be seeing you again for the next one.